Apple's probably quintessential of that group in that they get 90% of their components from the PRC, and they're realizing that there won't be another iPhone unless they can relocate and do so quickly. So we're seeing that cascade throughout the manufacturing sector. The Chinese also have shut off phosphate exports because they're having a food insecurity issue. At the same time, the Russians have shut off potash exports and nitrogen exports because of the war. So we also have a global fertilizer shortage that is now coming to the fore that is going to generate far lower crop yields on a global basis this calendar year. So we're already seeing all of these threads that used to be woven together into this tapestry of globalization being pulled out. And each time you pull out one, it drags 4 or 5 more with it. And we're seeing a broad scale collapse about what makes globalization work from the top and from the bottom at the same time, independent of the demographic question. One of the things that dominated manufacturing supply chains in the globalization era was this concept of just in time. That shipments, transport were cheap, they were safe, and they were above all reliable. And so you could maintain a small inventory of product that would only allow you to function for 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And you could place orders with your suppliers relying upon their shipments of your components to arrive in a week or two. And you could just plan on that entire supply chain feeding through. You had very low inventory. As soon as you made a product, you shipped it out the door. Everything worked in perfect harmony. That's no longer possible. And there's 2 ways that you can try to get around this. The first one is, like you said, the diversity of suppliers. The problem with that is it faces all the same restraints in terms of capital and labor in order to achieve the end goal. So you're talking about prices for the components being doubled if you have twice the number of suppliers, tripled if you have 3 times the number of suppliers. You'd have to build all of that out in order to get the same economies of scale. The second option is just to do away with economies of scale altogether and near shore or onshore and go with a different manufacturing system that, instead of being just in time, is based on just in case. And then you and all of your suppliers maintain independent inventories and have a supply chain system that is closer to the end consumer that ideally has fewer steps. Now, that first step, the diversity of suppliers, that is something the Japanese and the Koreans are definitely pursuing because it allows them to maintain more or less their same operational structures. The Europeans are not doing that because they don't have anywhere else to go. Take the German manufacturing system for automotive, for example. It taps into existing labor pools in Poland, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, in order to maintain access to different price points and labor skill sets to optimize. Well, there isn't a second place in the vicinity of Europe that could fill that role. So they can't do that at all. They also can't really do the just-in-case system because they, for the most part, are not the end consumers of their product. It is exported somewhere else. So that entire Germanocentric manufacturing system is not designed for the world that we're coming to, and they really don't have an alternative. On the flip side, you've got the United States and Mexico, where the consumption is primarily local, and a lot of the production scales, if it's not electronics, are already done on continent. So every time you bring back another incremental piece, you get more network effects in a place that has 1/3 of global consumption. So the US can maintain a little bit of that just in time, but it can go to just in case a lot easier because the end product and the energy and the inputs and the consumers are all more or less in the same place. Let's start with the short term before going to the long term. The Chinese stopped phosphate exports late last year, and they were the world's largest exporter. The Russians largely stopped potash exports in the first month of the war because most of their export points go through the Black Sea, which is a war zone, and ships are having trouble getting insurance indemnification. So the ships just won't go there. Or if they do go there, they have to get a sovereign indemnification from another country. The third type of fertilizer is nitrogen-based. The Russians were the biggest exporter of the components for that. And the Europeans have stopped producing nitrogen fertilizer because natural gas prices in Europe are now 7 times what they are in the United States. And it's not economically viable. So even if all of this magically went away today, we already have had too many months of interruptions to the supply system, and it's already too late for the planting and harvest years of 2022. So we know already from what has been planted or not, and what has been fertilized or not, that we are going to have a global food shortage that's going to begin in the 4th quarter of this year. We only, for example, have 2 months roughly, of global wheat storage. Half of that is in China, and the Chinese storage system sucks, and it's probably all rotted, just like it has been every time they've tried to build a grain reserve before. So we're going to chew through our backup very quickly when it becomes apparent that the harvest season this year just isn't going to be that great. Replacing or augmenting fertilizer production is not something you do in a season. Phosphate and nitrogen infrastructure for the processing and creation takes a minimum of 2 years. 3 years is probably more realistic. And for a potash mine to be brought online, you're talking a decade. It's just not something that we're capable of fixing anytime soon. And this is just disruption from one part of the world. One of the really dark things about agriculture is that the supply chain system is so integrated with everything else that if you have a failure at any point in the process, you immediately get an agricultural crisis. If you have a financial shortage, farmers aren't able to finance their seed and their inputs. If you have a manufacturing crisis, they lose access to equipment. If you have an energy crisis, they can't fuel the equipment. They can't make things like pesticides. If you have a industrial commodities shortage, fertilizer is removed from the equation. It doesn't matter where it happens. It doesn't matter what the scale is. You pull that thread out and it pulls a lot else out with it. And that means some farmers in some parts of the world simply can't produce what we expect. We have exceeded the carrying capacity of the world if it deglobalizes. There is no way, in the best case scenario, that we get out of this without losing 1 billion people. The Russians always had to try this. The Russian state in its current form is indefensible, but if they can expand out through Ukraine to places like Poland and Romania, they can concentrate their forces in the geographic access points to the Russian space. Their idea is if they can forward position like that, then the Russian state can exist longer. And I think overall, that is a broadly accurate assessment on the Russians' part. So it's not that they're not going to stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that they're not going to stop when they have all of Ukraine. Ukraine is just like step 4 of a 7-part process that involves a general expansion. Here's the problem for this year. We know from the way that the Russians have failed tactically in the war that in a direct confrontation between American and Russian forces, the Russian forces would be obliterated and would leave them with only one option: escalation to involve nuclear weapons. And so we have to prevent that from happening. That's the primary reason why the Biden administration in specific and all the NATO countries in general are shipping so many weapon systems into Ukraine for the Ukrainians to use. We just have to prevent anything that would make American forces face off against Russian forces. And since the Russians ultimately are coming for NATO countries, that means we have to try to kill the Russian military completely